This next video is on disorders of hemostasis. So bleeding disorders or clotting disorders. So there's two major types. Thromboembolic disorders. A thrombus is a clot. An embolus is a moving clot. So a clot that gets dislodged and starts traveling throughout the body is called an embolus. If that moving clot, the embolus, gets lodged somewhere, it's called an embolism. So you can see where these two words might come in. So thromboembolic disorder is a clot formation when we don't want one, an undesirable clot formation. And just the opposite, a bleeding disorder prevents normal clot formation, so someone could bleed uncontrollably. Someone's unfortunate enough to have both of these conditions, that's DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulations, which is both widespread clotting and severe bleeding. Here's some of those terms that I just mentioned earlier. Thrombus is a clot that develops and persists in unbroken vessels. So a thrombus is an unwanted clot, and that's going to restrict the blood flow through that vessel. An embolus is if that thrombus breaks free and starts floating throughout the bloodstream. So you got this clot that was a clot, this thrombus, it gets dislodged, it's traveling in your circulatory system, in your blood vessels, that's an embolus. Now that embolus will eventually hit some narrower or smaller blood vessels, and it could eventually get plugged somewhere. So that embolus becomes an embolism. Now it's just plugging or completely obstructing a vessel. If it happens in the lungs, it's a pulmonary embolism. For example. So risk factors here is atherosclerosis, which would be hardening of the arteries, slow flowing blood, not moving blood, just because someone's immobile for long periods of time. So there's some risk factors on why these processes can occur. These are some drugs to prevent clots, anticoagulant drugs. An aspirin can do that because it blocks platelets from sticking together and forming a plug. Heparin, if you have lab, AMP2 lab, I think your first lab experiment involves some heparin to prevent clotting from blood in test tubes. And you can read some other ones here. So bleeding disorders really exist in two types. A platelet problem or a clotting factor, which are the clotting protein problem. Thrombocytopenia, well, let's break that word down. Penia is a deficiency, thrombo is clot, cyto is cells, so a deficiency in clotting cells. Clotting cells are platelets, even though they're not actually cells. They're fragments of cells, but regardless, that's the name. And what happens is a person with thrombocytopenia doesn't have very many platelets. And tiny blood vessels get injured all the time in our body, sometimes just from moving around, and we're not aware of this. But you would be aware if you had thrombocytopenia, because these petechiae start appearing all over the body, which are little areas of hemorrhage because little vessel injuries are not being repaired. Compare that to hemophilia, which is another bleeding disorder, but it does not involve platelets. It involves the clotting factors. Remember, there's 13 of them with Roman numerals, and there's different types of hemophilia, depending on which clotting factor is deficient. So hemophilia A, which is the most common type, most of cases, is a deficiency of clotting factor 8 of the 13, and you can see other deficiencies with other types of hemophilia. So life-threatening bleeding is the result here because a person has problems stopping the bleeding because of the lack of or insufficiency of the clotting factors.